Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians, with a single advance in favor of the Ukrainians. The Russians have defeated the majority of the Ukrainian presence in the western outskirts of the Kursk region, and the final parts of Russian territory held under their control, and have entered into the Sumi region at a new point. The Russians also continued offensive operations in the direction of Kopiansk, in the western bank of the Serb River line, in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, in the direction of Pokrovsk from the east, the southwestern outskirts of the Dunesk region, and in the Zaporizhia section of the front line. The Ukrainians managed to regain control over Popiv Yar after weeks of fighting, where the Ukrainians have attempted to kick out the Russian foothold and the Russians have been attempting to hold on to it. And right now, the Ukrainians are having the upper hand with full control over the town, while the Russians are heavily bombarding it, trying to re-enter it. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to defeat the Ukrainian presence on the Kursk side of the border, leaving just these two parts near Tetkino and Utruba remaining under Ukrainian control of Russian territory. The Russians instead entered into the Sumy region and gained control over the town of Bezalivka. The entry into the Ukrainian side of the border will likely happen at many more points across the border as the Russians plan on creating their buffer zone between Russian and Ukrainian territory. An interesting part is the two towns of Voroshba and Bilopilya are well connected to highways and railways, while also being somewhat large towns, which means that they are being used for Ukrainian forces as major logistical hubs for this frontline position. And this also means that the Russians will have that as their main target for a push in this section of the border. If the Russians gain control over Voroshba and Bilopilya, they can use that as a launch board for future offensive operations in the direction of Sumy from the northwestern flank. Also allowed the Russians to establish supply lines across the border area, as it is connected to a Russian railway that goes through Koronevo all the way down south towards Bilopilya and Voroshba. So we see that this will be one of the main targets of the Russian forces with offensive operations across the border. And this is why the Ukrainians have been using this section of the front line to launch new offensive operations, as they is also an area where the Ukrainian forces are well supplied. This means heavy fighting will likely continue here, even if the Ukrainians are kicked out of the border. However, as it stands right now, the Ukrainians have a significant logistical advantage in this section of the front line. They have the railways and highways that connects to large towns across the border. The density of Ukrainian towns across the border here between the Sumy and Kursk region and this specific section is larger on the Ukrainian side, and the Russian side have the same river that goes through this section of the front line, which makes it difficult for the Russian forces to supply the frontline positions. However, the Ukrainians have, despite that, been unable to properly establish an offensive across the border, which shows that the Russians now, compared to a year ago, are much more prepared for any Ukrainian incursion. Despite the Ukrainians launching a significant attack on Titkino, they've been unable to capture the town, despite it being right on the border, close to logistical hubs of the Ukrainians, with difficult supply for the Russians. That means the Ukrainians had every possible advantage that they're able to get at this point in the war. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Kupiansk and across the Serb River line. In the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians continued offensive operations on the town of Radkivka, where, according to some Russian sources, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the town, while Syriac maps and Ukrainian sources have yet to report this. There's been a lot of back and forth reports between Kinderashivka and Radkivka, both with geolocations, a lot of movements. Generally, these towns are switching hands very often, which means that even if the Russians have gained control of Radkivka, it may return to the Ukrainians within a few days. This depends on the developments that follows. According to the Russian Minister of Defense, the Russians have managed to gain control over Moskovka and Sobolivka. This is extremely unlikely, as we see heavy fighting continued over Kinderashivka and Rakivka for a long period of time. and the Russians have been unable to consolidate these positions yet. Yet, the Russian Ministry of Defense report about settlements beyond that. This is likely a continuation of several reports coming from this section of the front line, where the Russian Ministry of Defense reports the capture of towns that they have not captured. This is especially true for Synkivka, here to the northeast of Kopiansk, the town of Stepova Novosilka. These are areas where the Russians have claimed control of several times, yet it took a very long time before they were actually captured. The same with Kindrashivka. This was reported to have been captured by the Russians several weeks ago, yet they still do not control it. Across the Serb River line, the Russians made numerous advances. They managed to advance to the northern and southern flanks of Zelena Dolina, and they managed to advance south of Karpivka. The Russians are here looking to cut off the supplies to frontline Ukrainian positions and straighten out the front line by capturing Zelena Dolina and the forest lines and forest patches in the area. They have strengthened and widened the operational encirclement of Zelena Dolina with the capture of the forest lines all the way up to the road itself, and expanding their zone of control in the western direction, widening the road control over the Ukrainian forces to find control over the road, with almost complete physical cut off of the remaining parts of the roads, which would physically encircle the Ukrainian forces remaining within Zelena Dolina, where the Russian forces are storming the town, fighting the Ukrainians head-on, while also bombarding the Ukrainian positions in the area. With the capture of the eastern parts of Karpivka from the eastern bank of the River line, the Russians are now expanding zone of control from that direction as well. This is to move in the direction of Sereshne, aligning the front line and pushing down further south will allow the Russians to start fighting over one of the main supply lines leading to Liman from the western direction. The heavy fighting continues in the western bank of the Serb River line in this month as well. Further south, the Russians have managed to advance to the north of Ryurivka in the direction of Orhova Vasilivka, gaining control over further parts of the canal in the northern direction, as the Russians are looking to flank Orhova Vasilivka from along the canal. Russians will work on fighting over the fortified positions rather than advancing through Orhova Vasilivka itself. This is due to the fact that Orhova Vasilivka is almost completely destroyed, with almost no buildings left standing within the town due to how long the fighting has been taking place over the settlement between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. It is already being split between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the middle, and the main resistance the Russians are facing are through the fortifications and not the town itself, which means that the Russians, with their flanking maneuver over the fortified positions in the western and northern flank of Orhova Vasilivka, will have a better chance of gaining control over the town compared to storming it directly. Also, a lot of Russians are focused on the main Ukrainian positions along the fortified positions rather than the town, which is now just a bunch of open fields with a bunch of holes in them, as the buildings themselves are wiped out. Gain control over the fortified positions will allow the Russians to gain control over the town itself and start fighting over the next settlements such as Minkivka, Polyubivka, and Privilya. Further south, the Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Novokonomishne, while the Ukrainians managed to recapture Popiv Yar in the north. In the direction of Popiv Yar, the Ukrainians managed to regain control of it. Heavy fighting has continued over the town, where the Russians have made several attempts to gain a foothold and have sometimes established a foothold, but have been unable to completely consolidate the town as the Ukrainians launch continuous counterattacks throughout the months of fighting taking place within the town. This is what has prevented the Russians from continuing offensive operations beyond it. Instead, we have seen a lot of fighting over the town itself. The Ukrainians continuously counterattack, while the Russians continue to establish themselves within it. Now, after months of fighting, the Russians were kicked out and are now attempting to re-enter it, while the Ukrainians are attempting to fortify it and entrench themselves within the town, where the Russians are launching artillery strikes and airstrikes on those positions ahead of the assault to weaken the Ukrainian positions before storming them directly head-on to attempt to kick out the Ukrainians and regain control over the town, move onwards towards Poltavka and the defensive line here to the northeast of Pokrovsk. Speaking of this defensive line, the Russians have not just shown that they have control over Myrolyubivka, but they have also entered into Novokonomishne, as we see with this geolocated footage of the Russian forces dropping off infantry within the town. The Russians launched an assault with 1 turtle tank and 2 turtle BMPs. These are heavily fortified vehicles that do not have a lot of combat prowess. Instead, they are heavily fortified. The Russians managed to drive through despite several Ukrainian UAV strikes and reach the town itself. Once they reached the outskirts of the town, the tank split up to cover the flank, while the BMPs drove further in to drop off the infantry that they are carrying. They dropped off the infantry at the start of the settlement and the forest lines, and within the furthest peak they managed to reach before returning back to base. Despite numerous Ukrainian drone strikes, these vehicles were not destroyed. They were able to return based on the footage, and the tank itself also managed to survive. From this, the Ukrainians managed to strike these vehicles, but due to their over-reliance on drones and the Russian counter ability to act against these drones, they did not take any vehicular casualties. The Ukrainians then acted on launching drone strikes as soon as the Russian soldiers disembarked from the vehicles. The Russians likely took casualties from this, and this is how the Ukrainians adapt to it, because if the Russians are able to drive into the town but are unable to drop off the infantry, then the drive itself is pointless even if the vehicle survives. So instead, the Ukrainians are now focusing on the infantry rather than the vehicles. However, this also shows the lack of Ukrainian artillery, ATGMs, their own vehicles to defend against Russian pushes, and this shows why the Russians are continuing to take advantage of the lack of Ukrainian manpower and firepower to launch continuous offensive operations, regaining control over several areas. Despite Ukrainian counterattacks, they are able to establish themselves within these settlements. If the Russian soldiers that managed to drop off within the town and survive are able to entrench themselves and establish a supply line from Myrolyubivka to Novoekonomishne, the Russians will be able to expand their zone of control, gain control over several settlements, establish themselves in the southern parts, connect Mikhailivka with Novoekonomishne, expand the zone of control on the western bank of the Krasny Torets River, and to move on to and connect their forces in the north with the ones in the south, gain control over Novoekonomishne itself. Will be able to encircle the Ukrainian forces within Mykolaiivka and the forest lines here to the east of it, establishing full control over the eastern bank of the river line and gaining a foothold and a passage through the fortified line east of Pokrovsk towards Mirnorod. This means that the Russian push into Novoekonomishne and their dropping of infantry into it is a serious breach in the Ukrainian defensive line east of Pokrovsk. The Russians also managed to advance to the southwest outskirts of the Dunesk region, where they are flanking Merina from the north and from the south, attacking it from both directions. The Russians have control over the fortified positions and the entirety of Dubne in the north, and with control over the Rivka and fortified positions in the south, combined with the control over Komar, they'll be able to attack Merina from three directions, gain control over which will open the road for a flanking maneuver by the Russian forces to the rear of Voskresenka, fighting over the fortified positions from their weak spot and pushing the Ukrainians into the Dnipropetrovsk region out of the Dunesk region for future offensive operations by the Russians to the outskirts of the border area. The Ukrainians have launched numerous counterattacks in the direction of Dashne. However, so far they have been unable to regain control of it. They managed to enter into the town and entrench themselves within it, but Russian forces continued their own offensive operations and managed to kick them out. Therefore, a lot of back and forth was taking place within Dashne, and no conclusion has taken place on the outcome of the battles, but there's a lot of back and forth taking place. Further south, in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Kamyansk, near Lukove and Stepove. The Russians have managed to secure some of the forest lines here west of Stepove as they continue offensive operations on the eastern flank of Kamyansk. Russians are slowly working their way through the bridges across the river line and now also the eastern flank of the town to gain control over all of these fortified positions near the town, to establish additional supply routes into it, and to advance further north along the river line and along the Dnieper river line towards the northern parts of the Zaporizhzhia region on the western flank of the defensive line of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line. We see heavy fighting continuing all across the front line and a potential restart of offensive operations by the Russians in the Sumi region, while there is no updates on the Kharkiv incursion in the northeastern outskirts of the region. We'll likely see additional fighting along the border area by the Russian forces, both in the Sumi and in the Kharkiv regions, with additional pushes and incursions into the Kharkiv region and an expansion of already existing offensive operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.